I suppose we better get started with chapter 7. So this is kind of our third sequence, or the third set of the Sermon on the Mount. So the Sermon on the Mount starts in chapter 5 with the Beatitudes, and Jesus continues speaking for this extended length of time in the Gospel of Matthew. This is the longest speech that Jesus has in the Gospels, the longest extended speech, like all at once. Depends a little bit on how you read the end of the Gospel of John and whether Jesus said all of that in one go or not, and how many chapters happened at the Last Supper. But that's something that Scripture scholars debate on greatly. So to review a little bit, he began with the Beatitudes. That was kind of the opening preamble. He launches into salt and light and the law, talking about kind of a new animating principle for life, to be like salt in the world, to be something that raises the flavor, something that changes things, something that other people can see, that gets noticed. He brought up the example of murder and anger, of adultery and divorce and sexuality. Jesus takes these commandments of the Old Testament and he makes them more interior. He makes them more internal. So this is where we got those phrases, "You have heard it said, you shall not kill, but I tell you, everyone who is angry with his brother has committed murder in his heart." So he's taking it kind of from the external to the internal, to the interior. He does the same thing when it comes to sexuality and sexual sins. You've heard it said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I tell you, the one who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart. Like he's actually taking it and making it more intense. He makes it harder to fulfill. He's also going to give the Holy Spirit to help us. He talks about truthfulness. Is this the part, let your yes mean yes and your no mean no? Try to remember. I feel like it's not. He was talking about, it's got something about truthfulness. I wrote it in my notes. It's somewhere in there. We'll see. It'll bounce around a little bit and maybe it'll come back to me. Response to others when they hurt you. Like, you shall hate your enemies. This is another phrase where he talks about turning the other cheek. He talks about embracing a different way of living. Then he dives into the acts of righteousness, prayer and fasting and almsgiving. So he teaches the Our Father. He talks about, like you've heard it said, you shall not, or he talks about like praying to your Father who sees in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you, going into your room, going into your interior room. And then he dives into these topics. We kind of covered these a little bit at the end of last time. These are certainly challenges: anxiety, judging others, prayer, the problem of not feeling heard. And I think that what I would propose to you is a couple of things as we look at this overview. This is more systematic than it first appears. If you start thinking about it, it's kind of like he's dividing life into different areas and looking at them one by one. And he's covering major topics and reinterpreting major commandments. He's talking about a different way of fasting and a different way of almsgiving and a deeper way of praying. And there's a structure here that I would encourage you to take a step back and consider, because this is more, there's a deeper pattern, there's a deeper understanding in the writing than you might get when you first read it. When you first read it, it can feel like it kind of just jumps from one subject to another. That's where the commentary, the book, is really helpful, because it starts to draw out some of that theme and some of those structures. And as you read it again, like if you think about, well, what areas of life does he touch? And you start considering it, and you discover that he's kind of hit on everything. It's like he's just moving around and finding the different areas. And I think that he proposes things, he touches on things that feel like they're just as alive today as I think they were to his audience. Sometimes we imagine that ancient people were a lot different than us and that things were a lot different. They certainly didn't have light switches, and they didn't live as frequently in places that were cold, because that's not really conducive for life when you're outside. But if you look at the major issues that he identifies and you think about the ones that he speaks on, it's amazing how intelligent it feels, how right on cue it feels, because you could rip a lot of this stuff out of the modern world. Struggles with anger, struggles with lust and adultery, how you give, and those kind of things in our culture today. I mean, so much of this could be written in headlines today, and yet this gospel is the better part of 2,000 years old. Depends a little bit on where you put a few things, but the better part of 2,000 years old. So we can launch into chapter 7 then. Judgment and discernment. It talks about people turning against each other. One of the things that happens in this chapter is the same that is happening in some of these other places. Jesus wants to introduce a kind of new animating principle. What is meant to be the new principle that guides Christian relationships? Anyone want to give a guess? The new thing that he is proposing that is at the heart of what relationships should be. It's actually really simple.
Treat others like you would want to be treated.
To treat others like you would want to be treated. I think that's a good beginning. Anyone else?
Respect.
Respect. We could say that. If we take it to a deeper level, I would propose to you that one of the new things that he's saying is to treat others like he has treated them. But I think another good way to say it is that this too should go in both directions. We should work at treating ourselves like Christ treats us. To love and to practice mercy internally as much as externally, because lots of us deal with harsh inner critics and voices that kind of push us toward good things sometimes and push us toward excellence. But sometimes those voices can be really mean. Sometimes there's a lot of self-rejection and there's a lot of interior things. And it's like the new principle that he's calling for is a world that is animated by his love and forgiveness. A world that is caught up in the way that he loved us. This is part of the prayer that he mentioned when he teaches us the Our Father. We all pray together, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And in many of the parables, he'll use this same context, like God has forgiven you so much, and so you should forgive other people. And it's everything from, how you think of the people that are driving on the road with you, to how you treat people that are part of your family, to how you treat people when you're having a bad day. I mean, one of the places where I would say the proof is really in the pudding is, what do you do when nothing goes right? What do you do when your plans aren't happening? What do you do when you're frustrated, when you feel alone, when you feel afraid? That's when you kind of learn how deep your Christianity goes. I remember thinking that. So a few years ago, I was in New York City. We were flying out when there was this crazy, giant set of thunderstorms that stretched from Columbus to Maine, Columbus, Ohio, eastern Ohio, all the way to Maine. And the TSA office, or the Federal Aviation people, the FAA, their office that governed or oversaw, that had the air traffic controllers for New York City. It's all unified, it's all in one office. And there's 3 major airports, JFK, LaGuardia, and Newark, that serve the New York metro area. They were only staffed at 50%. So we were stuck at this airport, and there were about 40,000 people whose flights got canceled, all at the same time. And so, I was caught in that. And you could not find a rental car from Boston to Washington, D.C. You could not get on a train in any direction whatsoever for less than $1,000. And lots of it was just sold out. And I eventually called a cousin, and I'm like, can you go online and book a hotel for me? I don't care where it is, as long as it's in Newark, and then I'll figure out how to get there. As I'm waiting in line at the airport counter. And there's like 10,000 other people waiting at airport counters, and some people are angry and frustrated and yelling, and plans are getting disrupted. And it was like the counter people couldn't do anything either, because every time they put details in and rebook people on a flight, the computer canceled that flight. And it was just one thing after another. So I got on one of the first flights that they started flying, and it was 4 days later. And lots of people were delayed for a week or 10 days. And, it's like, that's a kind of situation where I just remember thinking, like, okay, this is where everything just went wrong. How am I going to act? How am I going to treat people? Because if you join in the chorus and you get angry and you start stamping your feet, that's going to do no one any good, because everyone in this airport is in the same boat. They canceled everything. They actually ended up at one point declaring a ground stop, so they weren't letting anyone take off at all. And then it took about 2.5 or 3 weeks for them to work all the kinks out of the system again, because of how airplane scheduling works. But like that's exactly what I mean. Those are the times, those are the places, when I go to school in the morning, I try to remind myself, arriving at the building a minute later is not a life or death thing. It really isn't. And if that means that I slow down a little bit more for a stoplight, or I am behind someone that's driving 20 miles an hour slower than I would like to be, like this morning, it's probably not a big deal. At the end of the day, it often takes me about 18 minutes to get to school, and this morning, even with lots of slow people and them driving crazy, it took 20. Are those 2 minutes life or death? And the answer is no. I eventually was able just to kind of sit back and enjoy it a little bit more. But Jesus talks about judge not and you shall not be judged. And this is a puzzle, because Jesus very obviously judges actions. He says, like, even to people, he's certainly merciful, but when they're caught in sin and when they're doing things that are wrong, he says, go and sin no more. He doesn't say, go and keep doing what you were doing. So, like, yes, he certainly, there is a dimension of judgment that has to happen. And this is difficult, because the modern world has taken this phrase and run with it. Like, who am I to judge was one of the famous lines of Pope Francis. And in one sense, it's absolutely true. Like, it's not up to us to judge who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. Like, in that broadest sense of it, that's something reserved to God alone. Sometimes people will ask, sometimes students will ask things like, well, did Adolf Hitler go to hell? And the best answer I can give is, I don't know. We should hope for people's salvation. We should hope that people, even who commit grievous crimes, even who, like, that's part of this Christian thing of loving everyone as Christ does. We are called, we are invited to love them and to hope for their salvation. But there's real issues that are at stake in the modern world, because I don't think it would be wise to take the phrase as sweeping everything under the rug and trying to say, trying to say that morality doesn't matter. Well, no, I don't think Jesus says that either. That's certainly not in the Gospels. That's not That's not something that I think he has for us. So there's this uneasy tension, because it's like, well, if you judge constantly, if you're constantly on every other person's case and no one ever lives up to your standards, that's not good, because that's just this constant place of tension. And I think the gospel is clearly arguing against that. And at the same time, to say, well, then nothing matters and everything is fine because God doesn't judge us, or, the Pope doesn't judge us, or however they construe it. Like, no, those are the two extremes. And I think there has to be a middle balance. That we are invited to confront evil, to be able to say, this is not an action that leads to salvation. This is not something that is good. I tell this to students all the time. Happens, you kind of feel like a broken record after a while. But at the same time, we're not meant to be against other people. And this is the challenge. Like, can you discipline someone? Can you have in mind when you are meeting a challenge, like, I am trying to do what is best in this situation. Not I'm trying to do what I feel like, not I'm acting out of an emotion. This is a lot of raw emotional energy, but am I aiming for what is best? And sometimes it's better to admit, I'm not able right now to aim for what is best. And say, that's a good time to just keep your mouth closed and say nothing. Because to act out of that kind of emotion, to hit people in the chest with something really raw, usually doesn't help. That's when tempers flare. That's when things can become very difficult. That's, I think, part of what it means when he talks about being against other people. If you see yourself in opposition to them, if we can learn to see ourselves as people searching for the truth together, we can look for what is true. And that means, that calling out behaviors that don't lead to heaven, okay. But at the same time, what is the heart of the people behind it? We don't really know. And this becomes important, that we can certainly judge actions. For instance, Jesus doesn't say, like, he just got finished saying, like, the man who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. It can't mean that you can never say that. You don't contradict yourself like 3 lines later, 3 paragraphs later. Jesus is saying something about being able to judge actions, being able to say, like, yes, this is wrong. Lying is wrong. Adultery is wrong. Murder is wrong. These kind of things. This lifestyle, doing drugs, this isn't going to lead you to ultimate happiness. This isn't going to lead you to fulfillment. At the same time, we shouldn't try and judge people's hearts, because there's a lot that we don't know. There was a great story years ago. Have you heard of Mount Athos before? It's in the Orthodox world. So it's a peninsula in Greece. And it's actually important enough historically that even in the formation of the European Union, Athos has a special thing in their constitution about how it's a protected area. It's a peninsula. There's 20 monasteries on it. They don't allow women to come into the area. It's all Orthodox men, all monks. And they live out there. But the story that came to mind is of this man who was an alcoholic and was living in the town, the central town. There's not much of a town because it's mostly all these monasteries, but there's a little town where the Greek government office is and a few of those things, and it's called Carius. So this man lived there, and he was an alcoholic, and he would get drunk and do all these things, and he met a monk, and he asked the monk to pray for him. And so the monk took it on himself to pray for him and to, work for his salvation. And this man, over the years, ended up remaining an alcoholic. So when he died, all these townspeople thought, man, look at this guy. He, went right to hell. Like, he's been an alcoholic. He continued. He struggled in sin. And this priest later comes out and he says, absolutely not. This man went to heaven. He appeared to me in a dream. And they're like, what? And so he tells the story about how this man was an alcoholic and did struggle with alcohol, but the progress and the strides that he had made over the years and the way that he was trying to turn his life around, and he's like, no, this man was saved. There can be that kind of contradiction. There's a Frenchman who appears, if you subscribe to Magnificat and you get the little Magnificat magazine for Mass, there's a Frenchman named Jacques Fesch who has been appearing in there with some frequency of late. He killed a man and the French actually executed him. He was in prison. He was given a capital sentence, so he was killed. And the French bishops are putting him up for canonization because while he was in prison, he has this dramatic conversion. And much of the stuff that we have from him, much of his writings, were from after this conversion. And in some ways, it's a really tragic story. It would make for a great play because he has this conversion. He realizes, what a monster he was. And he is dramatically sorry for his sin and, very repentant and lives with that and talks about asking God for forgiveness and how he forgives himself and the whole works. And then the French still killed him anyway. Which is, that's the kind of tragedy in it, is that they didn't reevaluate their sentence when it was clear that he had actually changed. But Jacques Fesch, I think it's like Fesch or something. But they've put some of his writings into Magnificat, so you can read these little excerpts from his journal and letters to his mother. They're beautiful. I think one of the things as Christians that we're invited to, this phrase is a great one, to share the splendor of truth. John Paul II uses this phrase, one of his most famous encyclicals, probably one of the most important documents for moral theology that's been written in the last, I would say 100 years, is his encyclical Veritatis Splendor, and it means the splendor of truth. And he wrote it as a kind of broad reaffirmation of traditional Christian understanding in the face of modern moral questions. So he talks about a ton of things that would be very familiar, this stuff on contraception and abortion and some of those things. But I think the phrase is very, very key because when we talk about sharing faith with other people, when we talk about evangelization, I think this part is important, to share the splendor of truth. In the modern world, young people today are not as influenced by arguments. It's not like you're going to make an argument about why they should be Catholic or why they should practice. Well, you should do this because, X, Y, and Z. I think that many of the people today are really convicted when they hear a story of transformation, when they see the way that it works in your life. When they see you having a terrible day and you're able to smile and to be kind to someone when everything inside of you wants to turn away from it, and they can see that. There is a gift to the church and a gift to beauty that is important. There's a way of life that the gospel lays out for us that actually is transformative for how we live. And yes, there are times to make arguments and there are times to make some, to reason from some passages in scriptures and say, the scriptures are saying this is where the Catholic teaching draws from. There are those times, but there are so many times that what people really need is compassion. And this is hard, right? I don't think we should pretend this is easy. One of the great speakers I heard some years ago talked about, someone coming to Mass and their skin was full of tattoos and they weren't wearing the right clothes and they sit down in front of you. And the speaker actually had this happen to him. So a person who clearly doesn't know what they're doing, who isn't, religious in any You're going to have to shut it off because it's going to keep ringing.
My phone is off.
Oh,
Watch.
I see. If you cover it, does it?
Huh?
If you cover it, does it quit ringing?
Supposed to.
Oh man. You know, I am looking forward to the day when things like smartwatches die. And not just because of this, but my sister uses one all the time and she's got all these gizmos on it. I'm like, I know, sometimes I think our phones have been the destruction of our brains.
That's true.
And it's amazing with kids. They all turn into zombies after school when they can take their phones out. It's kind of strange. But you know, like, so he saw this person and was just struggling with it because it's clear, like, you know, first thoughts going through his mind, she's being so disrespectful. Look at how she's dressed. You know, she's here, she smells, doesn't she care? And thinking all these things. And eventually he is like, this is one of those inflection points. This is one of those push points. Okay, you have someone who isn't living up to your standards. What do you do? How do you treat them? What is it actually to treat them like Christ? And he realized, okay, I can't say very much right now. I'm kind of upset and I'm kind of angry. So what it came to was he offered her the sign of peace at Mass and just smiled at her. That was as much as he could manage in the moment. And he does that and she starts to cry. And that's part of the story, is she was so afraid of being rejected and had felt so rejected so many times by so many different people. And this person who finally chose to reach out with compassion was part of the push that she needed to find a better way of life, to find a better way of living, to turn a corner from some of that same judgment and same difficulty. And I think that's such a good story because I would struggle. Like, you know, I don't think any of us could sit in that situation well. I'm more and more bothered when the Gospels talk about Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners, because it kind of means like he went to the bar. And those aren't very nice places. And people don't always behave very nicely. And I mean, we just imagine like immaculate Jesus who has these perfect followers around him who never quarrel. And it's like, no, that's not real. And the more you see it, then you think about homeless people and, you know, some of the people on the street, and it's like, I would struggle to invite them to my house for a meal. And darn it, that's what Jesus does. Like, Lord, why do you have to be, like, couldn't you be nice? Couldn't you be less annoying? And I think this is what it's pressing on. This is the kind of thing that it is really touching. Like, to respond with compassion. And if you think about so many of the encounters in the Gospels where people come and find Jesus and they experience this transformation, I think that was a part of it. And I think this has to go into and impact that theme of judgment and difficulty. You know, when we're standing off from people, thinking about them critically, it's like, where is the compassion? Where is the energy to reach into that situation? It's not usually with criticism. Like, you know, if you're critical, usually you want out of it. You're like, they're misbehaving, they should get that fixed, you know, they should figure it out, you know, come back when you're more ready to be here. And it's like, you know, I wonder, how ready are we? How ready is my heart? How ready is your heart? I mean, these are the things. I think this is what I mean when I say we have to wrestle with the Gospels, because this kind of stuff is real. I think most of us would be uncomfortable inviting the homeless people to come and share supper with us. And yet, it's like, this is what Jesus becomes famous for doing, and he annoys the Pharisees. You know, they sit back and they're like, well, he eats with tax collectors and sinners. He's not a good guy. He's, you know, living in sin. And I don't know. I don't pretend to have the answers to it, but I think this is what the gospel points to. The measure with which you measure will be measured back to you. Oh, that's rough. You know, if you're unwilling to be compassionate toward other people, Jesus says God will be unwilling to be compassionate with you. If your heart is generous and it's overflowing with love and forgiveness, then that's what you'll receive. And I think when we start putting it in this kind of context, I think you can start to feel why we would talk about this as a lifestyle that's a transformation. This is a different way of living. This is a different way of handling stress, of handling difficulty than most of us approach life with. This is something radically changing. And this isn't an easy way of life. There is nothing fluffy about this. I still can't figure out how the 70s got to like fluffy Jesus with butterflies. It's like, what book were they reading? Because try and practice this. Try and practice generosity in how you see and how you look at other people. And this is hard. It's like, well, they don't deserve forgiveness. Oh. When do you deserve forgiveness? You know, well, they're behaving badly. Oh, and you never do that. You know, they're not listening. Yeah. God's like, yeah, tell me about it. They're not listening. We could have a conversation. And so, again, it's to be animated by the same generosity, the same gift of God that He has given to us. To extend the same forgiveness that He has given to us. So, he talks about the splinter. You see the splinter in your brother's eye and you have a wooden beam in your own, and you say, let me remove the splinter. Or remove the wooden beam in your own eye first. Again, it's not to say that people don't need to be corrected, that there isn't a role for parents and teachers. There are. But I think we have to do it with the consciousness of our own responsibility, that we are not perfect, that we misfire, that we don't always get it right. This does seem to be exaggerated for effect. Like, I don't think Jesus is saying you literally walk around with wooden beams in your eyes. That would be painful, and you would crash into everything. But it's amazing. It's amazing how ready we can be to correct other people. And again, you want a place where Christianity really gets proven. Wait till someone comes to correct you. When they think you've done something wrong and you feel self-righteous and you feel like you're on the right track, you know, how do you receive them? Do you receive them gladly? Do you listen? What about when your emotions get activated and you're upset or you feel misunderstood? How does it work then?